Hey guys, Zeddy here. Welcome to the video. Today we're going to be talking Star Trek, but specifically we're going to be talking about my three favorite Star Trek characters, all tied for first: Commander Spock, Lieutenant Commander Data, and Lieutenant Malcolm Reed. Let's start with the hot take first. Yes, Malcolm Reed is one of my favorite Star Trek characters. Honestly, Enterprise is probably my favorite Star Trek, which I know is also a bit of a hot take, but that's also a whole different video if you guys wanted to see it. In all honesty, I don't really have a defined reason for why I like Reed so much, besides maybe that we're kind of kindred spirits. I mean, he wasn't really anyone's first friend on the Enterprise, and he's not great at getting close to people, and I'm also a very socially awkward introvert. More importantly though, we're both total drama queens who like to think that we come across as badass. Though I would like to think that I'd handle an almost certain death sentence a bit better than he did in the episode Shuttle Pod 1, also in Minefield, which brings us to my favorite Malcolm Reed episodes. So the first one I have here is North Star, which isn't really like a stellar Reed episode. He doesn't get a lot of great character development or anything. He does have a moment where he's the world's most relatable action gif in the history of ever though. So it's the Western episode and they're fighting the bad guys, and one of them grabs T'Pol, who is Reed's superior officer, and basically says, "Drop your weapon or I'll shoot her." Reed, knowing full well that phase pistols have a stun setting, shoots T'Pol. The guy looks at him, horrified, and he just gives the best, whatever, it's fine, look that has ever existed. If I can find it, I will put it in now. The rest of the episodes in this list are actually really good, like, Reed development moments and good plot moments and nice moral philosophy moments, as Star Trek tends to do. The first episode up is Minefield, and in this one we see sort of how dedicated he is to the older military traditions, but also how readily he'll give his life for his crew. Again, he's a bit overdramatic throughout it, but there's a lot of strength of character that comes from this episode as well. It's also one of the first times we see him making even close to casual conversation with his captain, and the fact that he's kind of terrible at it is oddly comforting to me. We often see main characters who interact easily and communicate well with others, so seeing one that doesn't really know how is wildly refreshing. Now onto the episode The Communicator, which is not one of Lieutenant Reed's finest moments, but it is an excellent episode in that it begs the question, is the Prime Directive worth the life of two senior officers? I think that one of the most famous moments in Star Trek that kind of reflects upon how human society could react to alien life is, of course, the moment when Vulcans first land on Earth and are greeted by Zefram Cochrane, and how there's one way that that goes in the main Trek universe and a wildly different way that that goes in the Mirrorverse. But I think this is a really good exploration of a different possibility. I'm going to try to describe this without giving too many spoilers, but basically what happens is two humans are captured by a pre-warp civilization that doesn't know other aliens exist and can visit different worlds. They then decide that they should essentially wipe out this whole species that they've just found in order to study them, supposedly in the name of science. And I thought that that was just a really interesting commentary on how humans' first meeting with a genuine alien species could go. I just thought that this was an exceptionally brilliant episode, and put it here because Reed is one of the main characters within the show. Now we get to move on to the countdown though, which is probably one of my favorite Lieutenant Reed moments. Because it's one where he actually lets all of his walls down and shows us just how much he cares about those around him and how the recent loss of life on the NX-01 has been affecting him. There's a lot of death in Season 3 of Enterprise, though it's a brilliant balance of filler episodes to major plot points, and it's one of my favorite seasons of any television show ever. But seeing someone who normally acts so tough show how much the loss of life matters, even when 27 deaths is a minute fraction of the billions they died to save, was a really refreshing moment. Enterprise had a way of digging deeper into the darker and messier sides of being a human being that previous Star Treks just didn't really get into, but it still held on to the optimism of the original series, and I thought it was brilliant. And that this moment in this episode was a great example of how they managed to do that. Speaking of the original series, let's move on to Spock, a classic favorite amongst Trekkies. First of all, I just want to say I know there have been actors besides Leonard Nimoy who have portrayed Spock, but he's the one who made me really fall in love with the character. His music is also one of the first things that I reach for whenever I'm feeling stressed or lonely or whatever negative thing. We're here to talk about why I love Spock, though. So, Spock kind of gave me two really good things that I desperately needed when I first found Star Trek. One was a genuine excitement about what I could do with the physics degree I was about to pursue after high school graduation. The other was permission to not know how to handle myself. Spock has a massive range of really volatile emotions, and being half Vulcan and half human, there was no blueprint for him on how to handle that. Similarly, I didn't know how to deal with who I was as a graduating high school senior going into college. I didn't know how to handle the emotions that came with that life transition, and a lot of Spock's greatest moments are when he doesn't know how to handle himself. On that note, let's jump into Spock's best episodes, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, it's just the first few episodes that I managed to think of, and we start with Amok Time. Amok Time? I don't know. Anyway, I love this episode for three reasons. One, it is Kirk's most ridiculous nip slip, plus the Vulcan costumes were hilarious. They were literally tinfoil. The second reason is that we get a really, really interesting look into the underside of Vulcan culture. No matter how hard this society tries to eliminate impulsive and emotional behavior, they can't. And I think that's a good commentary on humanity's inability to reach true perfection, especially when we reject or attempt to ignore any facet of who we are as a global species. Finally, there's a great moment at the end where Spock is thrilled to find Kirk alive. Of course, this also shows the inability to completely remove impulse, but it also gives us a really good look into how much Spock cares for those around him, and I found it quite beautiful. Next up, we have Spock's brain, which I don't love because of Spock's moments within it, though it does show a nice connection between him and Bones. But I do think that it's a really interesting episode to take and look at the difference between science expectations for the future in the 60s versus science expectations of the future now. That's honestly one of my favorite things with Star Trek, and this episode is a perfect way to do it. Next up, we have the Infinite Vulcan, which I really don't have much to say about besides it was in the animated series, which is sadly no longer on Netflix, but it's kind of another good contrast between what we thought space was going to be and what it is now. It's not particularly great character development or plot or anything, but it is some stellar entertainment. Next up, we have Unification, specifically Unification Part 2, since Spock isn't really in Part 1 in this episode, I do actually have a lot to talk about. So there is some character development for Spock in here around the relationship he has with his father. It's also a really cool look at the relationship between Vulcans and Romulans. But the really epic thing in this episode is honestly just, it has the dream team. Spock, Data, and Picard. I mean, honestly, I don't care what challenge I am facing. If those three are my backup, there is zero fear. I love them all, and I thought putting them together was just brilliant. I'm really not a fan of the whole the evil Romulan daughter of another timeline's Tasha Yar thing, but this episode was just absolutely brilliant, and I completely adored it. Now we get to the last, but certainly not least, Lieutenant Commander Data, everyone's favorite android with the innocence and curiosity of a child. He was honestly just an absolutely brilliant character. I know a lot of people say there are parallels between him and Spock since they were both essentially supposed to be emotionless. I think they're actually more inverses of each other though. I think the literary term is foils, though I definitely shouldn't be quoted on that. But Spock attempted to reject his emotions, while Data attempted to explore every human emotion he could in any way possible. And that kind of taught me to go from being okay with not understanding who I was or what my emotions were to finding a better way to try and understand myself. Looking at the human condition and human emotions from the perspective of an android honestly makes it feel easier to understand, but also easier to forgive. Data at one point, and I'm totally paraphrasing here, but he said something along the lines of, I'd be willing to feel sorrow or pain if it meant I could taste my dessert, and that really hit different. Our pain really is as important to who we are as individuals and as a species as our joys and triumphs. I think that's another overarching theme of Star Trek that has carried from the original series all the way through, even to Discovery and certainly to Picard. But I think that Data's fascination with and attempts to understand the whole of humanity is one of the best examples of that in the entirety of the Star Trek franchise. Also, much like with Spock, I also just love the actor Brent Spiner. Fistful of Data is my first best episodes in Data's category. Is honestly not even an exceptional episode in Data's story, but it is a great example of Brent Spiner's skill as an actor. The man is truly an absolutely remarkable actor, and this episode really shows that. Not only does he play a solid at least 5 characters, but one of those characters is malfunctioning, causing him to switch between Android and Old Western at the drop of a hat. This is honestly just a really solid example of great entertainment, and it's definitely one of the Trek episodes that I return to most often just for Brent Spiner. But enough fangirling over Brent Spiner, I'm here to fangirl over Data with his actual best episodes. So first up is Measure of a Man, which is a really interesting exploration into what defines a person, and I think that's a really important conversation to have. Obviously, in the era of Star Trek, when we're meeting all kinds of alien species and developing advanced artificial intelligence, a definition of what constitutes a person is really important. But I think it's also a conversation we need to have and that we need to think about right now as a species, as we do live in a very divided world, but that's getting a bit heavy. This episode really does show how much Data means to those he works with, as well as how much they mean to him, and it was a really good moment of character development in his story arc. Next up is Disaster, and I'll be honest, I don't particularly remember this episode, but there's one moment that stands out in my mind vividly. So Data has to essentially sacrifice his body to save the Enterprise with the help of Commander Riker, so he just casually turns to Riker and tells him to take off his heads. It's, first of all, a pretty funny moment of Riker trying to wrap his head around taking off that of his friend. More than that, though, it's a moment where Data gets to show how much he cares about his crew members. Obviously, Data literally doesn't have emotions, but him being willing to sacrifice his body for his crewmates was an exceptionally touching moment, especially because in a lot of Star Trek, there's the idea of sacrificing one's life for another being the ultimate human act, and here we see Data being willing to do that, not for the last time, and probably not the first time either. Speaking of everyone's favorite android making the ultimate sacrifice, that brings us straight to Descent Part 2. Now, both Descent episodes are really good, but I chose Part 2 specifically for the ending. This one is particularly difficult without adding in a bunch of spoilers, but it's just another really solid example of Data being a total cinnamon roll while saving all of humanity, and I adore him, and I love this episode. It's really good. I want to wrap this video up by talking about the one constant that runs throughout each of these characters, and that is that they strive to be better. The journey of each character throughout their various parts of Trek is genuinely a journey of getting to know themselves. Spock figures out how to balance his human half with his Vulcan half. Data explores every facet of humanity that he has access to in order to figure out who he is as a person, and what it even means for him to be a person, and almost human in a way. Reed even manages to develop his social skills and create meaningful, long-lasting friendships throughout his time on his Enterprise. I think that striving to be better, to improve oneself, to make better connections, to work to improve the society in which you live, is one of the main facets of what makes Star Trek, Star Trek. Reed is a kindred spirit, while Spock and Data both inspire me to try and be a better me. All of these characters make me feel a little less alone, and that, I think, coupled with the hope that they give me for the future, is why these 3 characters are all tied for my absolute favorite Trek character. That's it for this video, guys. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up. Maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. If you do, don't forget to also hit the bell icon so that you don't miss my future uploads. Also, if you enjoyed this and you want me to cover something else, whether it's something else in Star Trek, in Harry Potter, in whatever nerd fandom that you are a part of that you want to see more of in the bullet journaling community, then please leave me a comment down below and let me know. I hope you all stay healthy and sane throughout this global pandemic that we are all in, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys!